Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here tonight. I'd like to start the meeting by establishing that we have a quorum, starting with the roll call. John?
Here.
Nicole?
Here.
Jen? Here. Joe?
Here.
Corby?
Here.
And I'm here as well. We have a quorum. Thank you. Nicole, has the meeting been properly noticed?
It has.
And I'm going to look at the adoption of the meeting agenda. I'm going to ask that we have a motion to modify the adoption or modify the agenda to include shifting some order. I'd like to move board action approval of the interim equity statement up to the top of the list. Is there a motion to approve with that amendment?
So moved.
I have a motion from Nicole
Second?
and a second from Jen. All in favor, signify with aye.
Aye.
Aye. The agenda has been approved. Prior to reading the equity statement, I'd like to take a look at the interim equity statement that the board discussed at our last meeting. And for all of the reasons that we talked about, we do have an interim statement until a statement can be created through the strategic planning process. I think the board has had a chance to review, and if I could get a motion to approve the interim equity statement, that would be great.
So moved.
The motion from Joe, is there a second?
Second?
And a second from Jen. All in favor, signify with aye.
Aye.
Aye. I'd like to go ahead and read our interim equity statement to start our meeting. Each student has access to the resources and educational rigor they need at the right moment in their education, regardless of race, gender, gender identity, ethnicity, ability, language, sexual orientation, religion, family background, or family income. I'd also like to read our mission statement. Each student will acquire the knowledge and skills necessary to achieve their personal goals, thrive in a global society, and lead a healthy, self-fulfilling life. With that, I know we do have a comment, but I'm going to save that to later in the agenda. We'll move on to the superintendent's report.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks for being here today. We're excited for our superintendent's report, which will be from the academic services department, so they can start making their way. You notice we had to bring some extra seats because we're going to have a full, almost a full basketball team up here for the academic services portion. If I could just preface kind of the importance of this next presentation is what it means for our board, who has written very solid policies and also place a high level of accountability on leadership to produce student outcomes as well as operations. The presentation that you'll have today will be our metrics or our ways of monitoring student outcomes as far as the academic components and academic outcomes. We want to make sure that our community and our board are fully understand all of the types of assessments that we use, what's the why behind them, and how they serve both our students and our staff in allowing them to make educational adjustments based off the information that we put in front of you. I also want to preface, we are on, I think we would fairly say, a journey of transition of accountability in terms of student outcomes. And in most recent history, the most normalized metric that was presented to our community was in the form of our state report card. And while that is a system of accountability that our state and our community and our board expects, it is not the type of metric that allows for strategic moves by our staff. And it does not allow for us to make significant educational shifts that allow in a moment to support our students. So we use internal metrics in the form, and you'll hear about those today, that informs the progress of our students. We will get to it. We're on a journey of how to better inform parents about that progress, but most importantly, it allows the students to take ownership of their learning because they know where their skills are resonating or rising to the top, and they also can to advocate when they need additional support. So that's what you'll hear today from the team. So we're excited to have Dr. Hawkins, our leader of our academic services team, and her tremendous group of directors who she will introduce. Dr. Hawkins, I'll bring us over and turn it over to you.
Good evening, everyone. It's good to be here tonight. So tonight I'm joined by Adam Zingshine. He's our Director of Elementary Education. with Dr. Sarah Helberg, who is the Director of Special Services, Special Education, and Rosa Maria Larson, I have brain freeze, Rosa Maria Larson, who is our Director of Multilingual Programs, and Karen Stocks-Glover, who is our Director of Teaching and Learning and Innovation. And tonight, we are going to share information with you all about our entire assessment suite. And so it's going to span the continuum from pre-K all the way up to our 18 to 21. And so in my time of being here in Verona, I don't know that we've ever really had this type of comprehensive presentation that's really going to give you all a high-level overview of what we use to help drive and shape what we do in the classrooms every day. And so it also serves as a front runner or front load the work that we're going to share in our results policies. And so we're going to talk about the intervals, the frequencies, the why, contextually why we do what we do. So today, when you leave this space, we want to make sure that you understand the context for each one of the assessments that's given. You often hear in the media, you hear about the board exam, but you don't hear about the exams and street data and what teachers use, the anecdotal data, and the assessments that teachers use to inform instruction every day. So you're gonna learn more about those. We're also going to talk about our existing assessment strategy. We're gonna give you all the definitions of the assessments. We're going to share our current state, and we're gonna talk to you about our next steps and how we use data. I also wanna put into this space, prior to many of us coming onto the scene, many of our teachers had access to limited data. In fact, what we found is that our ability to access data, it was limited. It was limited at best. And so that, when we talk about using data to inform instruction, if you don't have access to the data, if you don't have access to have conversations about the data with your colleagues, it makes it very difficult. And one of the things we've talked about is removing and eliminating barriers. And so we use EduClimber as a place, as a repository for our data. And so our teachers now have access to data not only for their classroom, but for a grade level, so that when they're sitting at PLCs, they can make informed decisions, but also talk about instructional strategies and practices that is common to them. We're working to make information about students available to our parents, and that is something that we realize there's a vacuum, and that is something that we're working hard to make the data that we use and see available for our parents outside of the report card, outside of forward, so that they too know what's happening in the classroom. So I want you all to keep in mind, when we're thinking about assessment data, some reminders. It's important for us to identify consistent and purposeful assessments. And so oftentimes, and I'll say before us, pre-us, one teacher might use this, and another teacher might use F&P, another teacher might use NWEA. It's important that we are consistent with what we're talking about. And so we have come to a place where we've normed some things in our building. It's also important for us to strike a balance between the need for assessment and the time that it takes to administer assessments. Because you know what? You can assess and assess and assess. But then what do you do with it? And then when do you teach and teach and teach? So we have to make sure that we're striking a balance and that we're using this assessment data with fidelity. It's our goal to maximize the number of minutes for instruction in the classroom. So it's important for us to assess. It's important for us to know what's happening, but it's more important for us to take that information and maximize what we're doing. The teacher and the instruction provided is the most, it's like Dr. Clarity says, providing, the magic happens in the classroom. Well, we have to make sure that those instructional minutes are optimal so that our students achieve the outcomes that we desire. It's also important to acknowledge that 2022 were not routine school years. And so while I don't want to say, we all know that we lived through a pandemic, and I'm excited to say that when we talk about learning loss, you'll see that while there wasn't huge amounts of learning loss, there was still so many emotional and social things that we're still dealing with. And so those years were not routine. And so the way we administered assessments, the way students responded to assessments, all of those things were very different. So COVID did have an adverse impact on the experience of the students and staff and families. And so we're responding, but I will say, every day is a new day, and we're pulling back onions of a layer, and we're learning as we go. So what does all of this mean for us? It means that we interpret data with caution. Year-to-year comparisons need to be interpreted with caution because each year we're dealing with a different cohort of students. Remember that each data point represents a student. And so while you see this number, the number is a story. And so what happens with that student and the experiences that they bring, while it may say 50%, it's only a partial story in that 50% may show that the student grew exponentially, but it may only represent 50%. So it's a story. And so we also have to consider multiple data sources. So we consider the data that's presented, but we also consider student voice, we consider the expertise of the teacher, and then we also have to consider that street data. How does data from assessment drive teaching and learning? So we use it to make sense of where we've been and where we're going. It establishes data routines and we examine the data together. And so that's that PLC. It's also our SBLTs. It's also the work of academic services. It's also the work of cabinet. It can't be just something that's done in isolation, and we have to take it and make meaning of it. As data changes, it points us to where we need to make changes. And so we have to respond to what the data is saying to us. It's like, let the data speak to us. Let the data speak to us. Data helps us evaluate student, staff, and family voice, and it informs professional development. So we look at the data and we use it to drive and identify what we need and where we're going. So this screen, this particular slide, is a graph that shows a calendar year. And so we have several types of data. We have screening data, we have interim instructional assessments, and we have short cycle formative assessment. And those aren't terms that you often hear in our district, but they're terms that I'll share with you all that kind of help you all understand the frequency in which we use our data. So for example, our screening data, let me get to my notes. Our screening data would be something like STAR early literacy. And so that would be, we give to all of our students to see where they fall and what they need. Then our next level would be our instructional assessments, our interim instructional assessments. And so that would be our STAR assessment, and that's given anywhere from 3 to 4 times a year. And you're gonna hear a lot about our STAR. We use that, that is one of the assessments that we use in our results policies, especially for language arts and math. You'll hear about language arts next week. And then our short cycle formative assessments, those are classroom assessments. So those are things that the teacher may do in the classroom. They may be end of a course, they may be a teacher created assessment, but it's the day-to-day dipstick that the teacher uses. And then you'll hear about our summative assessments. And those are oftentimes what you hear about in the media. That's the forward exam. It's the one and done. And while people hear about it, and it's sometimes the one that gets the most notoriety, but it's also the one that, while it gives us information, it is sometimes the one that is the least impactful for us in the classroom. Again, this continues to talk about our academic assessment strategy, and you'll see, as I was saying to you, the formative assessments, you'll see the dots. It represents that they're given more frequent. You'll also see the larger blue dot in November, January, and March, and that talks about our interim instructional assessments, and then the summative assessment, which is the forward exam, and it's often this particular slide reflects the forward exam, but we also have access to other summative exams. again, this particular slide, so 4K, those are our youngest learners. A critical screener is our teaching strategies, goals, and our STAR early literacy, all the way to our pre-act, which is our secondary and ACT. I am going to pass the baton to Adam Zingshine. Not only is he our Director of Elementary Education, he also serves as our District Assessment Coordinator. So he is the one who works really closely with DPI to understand the intricacies of forward. It helps to make sure that we administer the test across our district with fidelity and all students are accounted for.
Thank you, Dr. Hawkins. So what we're going to start with is the STAR assessment that Dr. Hawkins referenced, and I think it's important anytime we're living in data, and we're going to live in a lot of data today, to remember a few things. One, like Dr. Hawkins shared, each one of these things is moment in time. And we bring all of them together, it affirms or calls into questions aspects of what we're doing, knowing that the magic happens in the classroom. And our goal is always to support our teachers so that the work that they're seeing their students doing each and every day in their class already tells us what we need to know about supporting our students, and that these assessments only affirm what we already know. And so as we kind of look, you're going to start to see some patterns that we'll come back to when we live in our results policies around things that we're doing really well as a district, and some areas that we need to continue to work on to support our teachers and support our students in improving. So we'll start with STAR. So what is STAR? So STAR is a benchmark assessment. Our students take it in fall, they take it in winter, they take it in spring. It's a computer adaptive assessment so that every time you get a question correct, the next question gets a little bit harder. You get a question incorrect, the next question gets a little bit easier. So after a few questions, you're kind of right at that kind of most challenging point. And then at the end of every assessment, usually takes about 20 minutes, child receives a score. And that score places them within different proficiency bands that kind of give us some information through our EdClimber system about kind of what supports might be needed. So students scoring in the bottom proficiency band, that's the urgent intervention band. And those are students at the school level that are staff members are having conversations around what are we making sure we're doing for these students. All the way to students scoring at an advanced level, and that's a level that we have set as a district, students scoring above the 80th percentile, which kind of gives us some information about supporting students who may be above grade level and what things we might be putting in place for them. And that unified score, whatever you get in math, early literacy, star reading, English, star reading, Spanish, that score kind of that number means the same things. That's why they call it that unified score. And that was an improvement that STAR made over the last few years that we've been able to adopt as a district.
And just really quickly, just want to also put into this space that, to Adam's point, yes, our staff has conversations about students that may fall in the lower 50 percentile band. We also look at students at the very highest of the band to make sure they're not sitting neutral. And so it's a both and making sure that a student producing at the advanced level, we want to continue to advance, knowing that there are different strategies that are needed at that time as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And really excited to share STAR data when we look at SGP. We'll live in that a little bit. That's really a data measure that attends to exactly what Dr. Claire just shared. So when we look at STAR, we look at it as a district in two different ways. We've used the book satellite data a lot in supporting learning around data use and bringing voice, student voice, family voice into the room when we're discussing data. So STAR data can be used as both map and satellite data. So for a teacher, that's map data. They're looking at the information about how students are doing and making next steps to identify how to address those skill gaps that might be present, how to push a student who's above grade level. For the purpose of our continuous improvement planning process and the data that you're going to be looking at, we're presenting it more as satellite data. So we're looking at a more global perspective. What are the patterns we're seeing across our district, across different demographics, across different levels that are guiding next steps for professional learning and support, knowing that that's going to shape and help align the resources that we have in our district towards meeting our students' needs, so that our teachers are best situated to use that data as map data on a daily basis in class. So how we've incorporated that into our SIP process. Our schools do goal setting. And so kind of bringing this data back to the school level, they're making decisions based on what they're seeing in their data to align their SIP work and the theories of action they've written in content, instructional practice, school culture and climate, personalized learning, and staff collaboration. With the assumption that those moves that they make are going to affect this in other data sets. So to be proficient in STAR means scoring above the 40th percentile. So basically, that's the proficiency bar. Anything below that, again, tells our teams at school about, these are some students that might need a little additional support. Students above the 80th percentile, same thing. These are students that might need some additional support. We don't forget about everybody in between. Those are students, though, that our data are saying are attending our core instruction is meeting their needs based on this assessment. So our mean, our average for STAR reading English as a district are over half of our students, 57%, scoring above that 40th percentile. So they're meeting the proficiency benchmark. And on STAR reading Spanish, also over half, 54% of our students currently scoring above the 40th percentile. They're meeting that proficiency benchmark. And the way our schools are setting their continuous improvement plan goals are any schools that are over 5% above the mean, because we always want growth. Their goal for the year for all students is to move. So say a school is at 70% of their students are meeting benchmark. Their goal would be to get to 71% by the end of the year. If we look at schools who are below that district mean, we want to see the highest growth. And then they're setting goals for their focus groups that are higher than that because we want to be doing gap closing work. So if the goal for all students is to grow by 5%, students are to set a goal that is above 5% for their identified focus group and attend to those with the next steps in their PD and their support, their coaching, and their walkthroughs as a school to help meet that goal for the year. So the other thing we look at is SGP, and that is the student growth percentile. And what that does is compare over time how a student is progressing relative to their same grade peers on that assessment with a similar score profile. So to Dr. Clarity's point, if the student is scoring at the 99th percentile, basically means that they're scoring above 99% of other students who have taken that assessment in the state. And the next time they take it in winter, they score at the 81st percentile. But they're still going to score at advanced, but they've regressed 18%. Their student growth percentile, however, is going to be very low. It might be 1, it might be 2. Because for all of the other students who are scoring the 99th percentile, they dropped 18 points instead of progressing. And so SGP is a way to control for that, to make sure whether you're below grade level, at grade level, or above grade level, that we are doing things that are meeting your needs and improving your experience. So schools have also set goals, and we remember the same presentation last year. Well, we've gotten there. We are able to look now at last year's data to set those goals this year. That's one data measure we added to our school SIP plans for this year. And so high growth is measured by students whose SGP is higher than 65%. So they're outperforming 65% of their peers with a similar score profile. Typical growth is between 35 and 65%. And low growth are students who are outperforming less than 35% of their peers at the same grade level with a similar score. So on schools' SIP plans, they've also set goals for SGP. So schools where over 70% of the students are showing typical or high growth, that is a very high mark. You are actually infinitesimally raising the national score by doing that. It is to maintain that. It's very hard to continue that trend, and it's actually mathematically improbable to be able to do that. All the way down schools where less than half of the students are showing typical or high growth, we want to see 10% growth. Similar to the proficiency data for the focus group, if your goal is to raise your SGP by over 10% for your focus group students, it's going to be higher than that because we are doing gap closing work. And that is how we've interpreted STAR data within our SIP process in the district. So what we've talked about with our schools, in meeting these goals, we want to be setting aggressive goals. We want to be setting goals that are going to be challenging to maintain. So what happens if we meet that goal? Well, we celebrate the work that led to it, we reflect on where improvements needed, and we adjust those strategies moving forward. And if we haven't met the goal, it's the same. We look at the data, we celebrate where we had growth, reflect on where improvements needed, and adjust those strategies moving forward. We're doing that at the school level. Grade level teams are doing that at the grade level. We are doing that at the district level and looking at our work. So I'm not going to get into this, but you'll see linked into this presentation is basically the process schools use to set those goals. They use Data Climber. For some schools, have very data-based focus groups. For example, some of our TWE schools are looking at students who are not meeting the benchmark in STAR and who are not improving in their access scores and are really narrowing down that focus group. And they've used Data Climber, that data system, to help set those goals for the year that we will be able to report on in spring after we've had a full year to attend to those. And then linked at the bottom is, which we'll get into more next week when we look at results policy R21.1 around literacy, really drilling into some aggregate and disaggregated STAR data. And at the bottom of that document, you actually see a summary of the goals and the focus groups for each of our elementary, charter, middle, and high schools that they're using to align their support for the year. Okay. Climate data. Who am I passing it to?
Do you wanna, are you chunking this?
We'll take questions now.
Okay, sounds good.
Questions from the board, anybody?
Yeah, just a random question. When you have students in pre-K and kindergarten who presumably cannot read, how long is it taking the teachers to, I'm guessing they don't read the questions to the students. How long does it take an average teacher to read to the students? Is it the same 20 minutes and is it the same progressive, like they're reading from the computer and the questions get easier or more difficult based on the students' responses?
For each of the STAR assessments, that is the case. Each of them are computer adaptive, and that's one of the reasons we think back to the results policies that we wrote. We're not giving the STAR reading assessment. Unless students have met the proficiency benchmark for STAR early literacy, which really looks at some phonetic, phonemic aspects, letter identification, sound identification, and each of those take, while it's untimed, each question will kind of time out after 45 seconds, because if you haven't attended the question in about 45 seconds, yeah, and teachers get data on that too to support students, and so really it's 20 to 30 minutes tops is what it's taking most students to do this, including our kindergarten and first grade students who are still taking the STAR early literacy assessment.
They take that on their iPad,
Mhm.
usually with earphones is what makes it so simply. The teachers doing each one.
In the first one, they take it on their iPad themselves.
All of them, yeah.
I really need to ask my kindergartner for better updates.
Yes.
She was me enough with this information.
Games to your kids.
Done.
Is that SGP data you were talking about, is that each time they take the STAR testing that data is available, or is it at the end of the year it's measured?
So it's not available in fall.
Okay.
Because you've nothing to compare it to.
Okay.
But between fall and spring, and then, or sorry, fall and winter, and then winter to spring, because now you have the full body of students who are taking this across the nation to compare, like if you've scored at a 312, it's looking within a band of all students who've scored similar to that, and historically how they've done between fall and winter to look at how you're progressing relative to other students.
So it's not year to year, it's kind of like you set the baseline in fall and that's your comparison point. Interesting.
And it's based on a percentage. There is no like goal setting like some other assessments like math where it'll set a projected score and you meet it or you don't. It's all based kind of in time on the students at your grade level with a similar score profile and how they've historically done between tested constraints.
Thank you.
So I think I heard this correctly, but I just want to make sure I'm clear. I remember like a year or two ago when we talked initially about how we needed to build a data literacy or system from the ground up because people were doing different things and weren't able to communicate or compare across sites or even classrooms sometimes. And that sounded like a disaster, but now it seems like we've got this implemented. So not all the way implemented.
Getting there. Moving
Well,
in
first
that
you said
direction.
2 years ago, we've only been here a couple months.
It's been a long couple of months.
Yeah.
Fun.
So we are still implementing where we are far better off. And Jason, you want to raise your hand right there? Or are you the director of technology? He's come in and done phenomenal work with the rest of the team to get our data systems up and running. So implementing is the best we can say.
Yeah, and John, I would add, one of the best, I think, pieces of information and evidence of how this has been built came this year when we were very mindful in the access we gave to data within a building, right? That can be very personal and really kind of laying your teaching bare toward your colleagues, and it was actually our schools that asked for that to be expanded. And so I truly think it's a really powerful bit of evidence of how this has been really actualized in our buildings, that there's a hunger for more, and we've been able to level up staff access to this based on their own desire for making this more a part of their team meetings, more a part of their PLCs, more a part of their discussions.
Yeah, I have to say, I like that. It seems like we're being presented with more powerful questions, more interesting questions than we were initially. Because you can compare and do these things. So it seems really nice.
Is there a structure within PLCs, or maybe it's just the makeup of the PLCs, where like if a more junior teacher was presented with this, I could assume that like when you get a whole bunch of data, it's like, oh my gosh, this is very overwhelming. How do we support maybe newer teachers, or how do we kind of share that amongst the groups?
Our PLCs at the school sites are supported by our instructional coaches. So notice our curriculum learning specialists, our language literacy equity specialists. And so they are often in spaces with PLCs and can help to make meaning and support any learner in their understanding of data. And they also support the development of those data cultures across all PLCs.
Thank you.
Yes, Steve?
One piece of, one assessment. The one slide, I just want to point out that our culture and climate survey is an assessment tool. And so it assesses the climate of our district and where we are. And so I want to put it in the space that it too is part of our assessment suite. And so, you know, we had a full presentation over it a few months ago, but that is important data that impacts the overall temperature and like climate and like environment of our learners. So it's important to know that we consider that, and it is one yet data point that we use to consider. So that is, you didn't see it reflected on our list, but it is an important piece of data that we consider, and it informs and influences everything. Adam will continue to talk to us about our forward data.
So to use a sports analogy, kind of the work we do in class, the STAR assessments, the other things we take, the Bridges interim assessments, those things, it's kind of like practice to the game. We know that Wisconsin Forward is a very public measure, and it informs a lot of things. And in the same way, when we know our students are learning every day, because we have formative assessment data, we have conversations with students, we're working with them, then we can be confident when they take things like STAR. We're going to see that there. And when we see growth in STAR, we can be confident that when we do the big state assessment in spring, we're going to see growth there too. And at a time where across the nation we're seeing regression in some of these scores, we are a district that has bucked that trend. We are moving in a different direction, and it's very exciting. So what we see here are the Wisconsin Forward exam, and for students with special needs, you take the alternative state assessment, which is dynamic learning maps. We'll go into that a little bit more in depth later. This is the aggregate data for that assessment in English language arts, and one of the reasons why we're seeing such promising state report card data is so much of that is based on this. It starts with participation. We obviously see a much higher rate of participation this last year than we did before. When we took the assessment the year before, I believe many of our students had just returned to school, some of whom are still learning virtually. That explains the participation rate from 2021. We are back above 96%, which is always kind of the goal for a state test like this past year. We see growth in the proficiency for all students. These are 3rd through 8th graders that take this assessment. And when we start to look at disaggregated data, we are seeing growth for some very important demographics of students as well, which speaks to the work our schools are doing in attending their focus groups. The moves they're making as a part of their theories of action to meet the needs of all of our learners can see growth there too. We have a long way to go, but we are seeing a higher rate of growth for some of our groups of students based on that really important work. Looking at math, also our 3rd through 8th grade students that take that assessment see similar patterns of growth and similar patterns of improvement and participation. Again, knowing that 2020-21 was quite a unique year, and can see again some disaggregated data for Wisconsin. Our 4th graders and our 8th graders take the science test as a part of Wisconsin Forward and see similar patterns there as well. And while we don't have comparisons on here, we've made the decision as an academic services team that comparing to the state is not as good of a measure as comparing to the growth we're seeing within our own district, because that's what we can attend to. We can say that these numbers outpace the state average in most cases.
I can't remember, in the communication that went out to the community, did it have this year-over-year comparison, or was it just this year's?
What would have went out to the community would have been kind of the summary of all of that
Yeah,
and how that is interpreted by the state within the different pieces of the pie that they use to calculate that. And so that would have looked at last year's report card data versus this year's report card data, but not the raw Wisconsin Forward data, because what DPI does with that data to get to that report card is they manipulate it in particular ways to account for different demographic groups. How are we moving the needle for all of our students, not just meeting proficiency benchmarks for some to get to that one score?
I want to, something I have to remind myself, and even when it's a celebration, we have to be very cautious of comparing year-to-year state report card data. It's really the internal metrics that are used to deliver the score are not always consistent, or very rarely are they consistent. And to do a year-to-year comparison can really set us up for making some assumptions that are not correct about the performance of our students. So we are really focused on the final score, as well as the internal assessments that we know that our staff can use to drive teacher goals.
Could you just say more about that? I mean, just to put it in the space of what can be erroneous about looking at that from a year-to-year perspective. I know there's a lot to that, but just.
You could have a higher percentage of just participation one year as compared to the next year, as I think was the case for 2021 and 2022. You could have a higher percentage if there's a higher focus on ELL performance. It could be higher one year as compared to another. It just depends on what the state is focusing on that year. So those are just kind of two examples of
Sort of external drivers that could get misinterpreted as internal.
if you only look at one score compared to the next, or 1 year compared to the next.
So just to clarify, the state changes how it weights different aspects. And so that's what can change, that whether the state's weighting or, putting more emphasis on a certain criteria 1 year, changing that from the next year, it's the state's formula changes.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And so again, we're definitely not dismissive of our final score in the state report card. We appreciate and value that. It's just when you start to look at comparative data, like this year to last year, or this year to next year, we have to be very cautious around just looking at the number.
do they change how they rate the proficiency across students, or is it more just the report card that they change?
Which one are you referring to?
So like we're saying don't compare year to year, but the 3 slides you just put up compared last year to this year, right? So does the state change what proficient is rated as year over year?
Not always.
No, they don't.
Okay.
The questions are always a little bit different, and they're always ascending to the same standard, but the questions are different. And Meredith, the formula the state uses, that very rarely changes. But how our enrollment, our participation, how our different demographics as a district are inputted into that formula, those are always changing. And so, we use an example, you can actually increase your proficiency as a school, but have your state report card go down because how you're attending to different demographics of students. You could attend to our formerly marginalized students and increase scores there see proficiency go down. It's all a very complicated formula of value added sorts of things. And again, it's all enrollment and demographics.
So I think I'm struggling a little bit then with what is the proper context for this forward exam results and how we should be looking at it or the public should be looking at it. Because I think I've alternatively heard we shouldn't compare year to year within our own district, but we also shouldn't compare within a single year us to statewide averages. What is the right way that we should be looking at this data?
So we're going to get into it
Okay.
a little more at other assessments,
Just
only,
preempt
and really it's, if we start to see regression in a forward assessment, and it's mirrored by regression in STAR, that tells a story. If it's mirrored by, we're seeing our students with special needs trending lower in certain measures, but trending higher in other measures, all of this kind of guides us towards what are the right questions to ask, what's the discussion we need to have to actually attend to what is the story here. There's a story here. And as we look at those different data sets, and forward is one of them. If we see massive improvements in Wisconsin forward, but regression in other data sets, that's very rare. But if that's happening, one of the questions that asks is, we actually need to look at our different assessments because it's not telling us what we need predictive of things like that. And so that is the conversation to have and why we're presenting this kind of across the span of our assessments today before we get much deeper in our results policies that look to more of kind of a closed set of data. Because all of this is what our teachers are using and what we're using to support program decisions across the district.
And when we talk about regression, that is compared to previous years, but what we're saying is it's not in a silo, it's not a sole data point. It's used as part of the bigger picture. Okay, I get it. Thank you.
Does the Wisconsin Forward exam start at third grade? Okay. And the problem I have with that is when I look at proficiency with Black and African American students, studies that I've been part of and witnessed, I see head shaking already, is that if we don't get us reading at third grade level, then we're not gonna get to fourth, fifth, and past that. So why, I guess when I see these numbers, it tells me that there's a need there to get Black and African American students proficient way before we start this exam at the third grade level.
Foundational skills work, early literacy, how we're attending to core instruction, how we're attending to our MLSS systems in the district is the story that it tells us there. And the decisions we need to be making to support our formerly marginalized students that schools are using to set their focus groups at the school, making very specific instructional and leadership moves to make sure that data changes.
Absolutely. That's a great question, Kirby. And then John, I just want to clarify as well, based off your question that I didn't say this accurately. The slide that we're on with the comparative of proficiency from 1 year to, I'm not concerned about that comparison. I'm talking about our final report card score.
Yeah.
Our final report card score, we could grow significantly in proficiency from year to year, and our final report card score can actually go down. And so I'm talking about that final score that everyone sees. You just have to be cautious of looking at it from one year to the next. Even internally, you're doing better.
So Tyler talked quite a bit about the forward exam. Within the forward exam, there is a sub-exam called the dynamic learning map. The dynamic learning map is for our students that have the most significant cognitive disabilities. And so it's designed to be for no more than 1% of our overall population. And so when you look at our numbers here, you can see that our participants are very, very small. And so in and of itself, we have to take that number with extreme caution. And so what we use the dynamic learning map for is to help us guide our instruction more in the line of how is the student doing and what would be our next step. So the dynamic learning map is done individually. We identify a profile of the student through a series of questions, and then we work with that student and a special education teacher to see where their skill level is. So it's really a one-on-one test administration using a lot of manipulatives to see what they're able to do. from there, we get results of emerging, approaching at target, and advanced. And so we just tend to look at that piece and like Adam said, it's a small piece of the picture. We tend to use more of our data on how are they doing on a day-to-day basis. We look at overall performance with IEP goals, looking at growth in reading, and this is just one other measure. Students who take the dynamic learning map are incorporated into our overall forward exam scores. And so when Adam presented that information, it did include students who were taking the dynamic learning map.
So in the Verona Area School District, we have 843 students who are multilingual learners identified as English learners. So that's almost 15%. We do have a federally mandated assessment that the state actually started in the state through WIDA back 20 years ago. And it was a consortium of 3 states that got together and decided, because that was a mandate, you have to assess your students on their English proficiency growth. So the students who take this exam are already identified through a screener. So when they enroll, we do ask the question, do you speak another language in your home? Does the student speak another language in the home? And they are screened to see if the student has any language development needs in English. And after that, any student who scores below a 5 composite on the access test is continued to be identified as an English learner. There's another portfolio or observation method that the state has adopted a couple of years ago to allow for more students to exit that status in those services at 4.5. But the student does have to show through other assessments, like we've discussed now, as well as through observations that the teachers make so that they are able to exit. The reason for that is because there have been research studies showing that after about 4.5 or 5, it's no longer language development needs, it's other potentially academic needs or other needs that the student may have to help them get to level 5, which is what we use. So the access test measures the proficiency in 4 domains of language. So listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So when a student, which did start on December 1st and goes until the middle of February, students are taking those exams right now. What happens is that the student listens to different longer and longer phrases or directions, and then they have to answer on the computer, it's all computerized. After that, and they do the reading, and then that doesn't have anybody talking to them, it's just them reading. Once they take those 2 exams, then it gives the teacher the information on what level writing test they should be taking based off of that. So depending on what their comprehension was with listening and reading. And the final piece after writing is the speaking, and that's done in a smaller group. It's much shorter, but one of the things that students have to do is be able to speak into a microphone to a computer. So it's a little different than it was years ago. They had interaction with teachers, but now it's on the computer. All these tests are combined. So there's the oral, and they do get 8 scores. That's how many scores they get. So they get listening, speaking, reading, writing, and they have an oral score, a comprehension score, literacy, and then a composite. It's a combination of these, and literacy, so reading and writing is weighted the most. It's just a breakdown of our students across the grade levels, K through 12. And as you can see at the bottom, the purple means 6, which is basically the students have exited those needing those services. 5 is bridging. We would still consider them to be exited at that point. 4, we're getting to that point where they might not need as much support. 3, 2, and 1. It's based off of the theory behind language development that it takes between, well,
used to be 5 to 7, now it's 5 to 10 years that a student would need to develop their language proficiency. Some of it is, well, a lot of it is based on the types of programming that they have, the literacy skills that students have. I mean, there's a lot of different factors in that. And we always talk about level 3 being the top of the social language. It's very easy for a student to go from level 1 to level 3. It's very difficult for a student to get from a level 3 to a level 4, because that is when they start entering into the language, academic language. So we have social language, and that's when students are able to interact with their peers, are able to interact fairly well in the classroom. But then when it gets to interacting with academic content that's heavy in language, that's a key moment that we have to give them the most support. So you can see most of our students, if you look at them, a lot of them are green, purple, and blue on this end. And then the area where we do need more support would be in the writing, which is pretty common. Some more information. Participation, of course, 2022, 2021 to 21-22 went up significantly. The percent of high growth. So the way that this is factored is that student growth percentiles, again, wanting to look at how much our students are growing. Most typical growth is 35 to 65%. That's what's considered typical. And as you can see here, that back in 1920, which is the last data point that we have for this student growth percentile, it was 70.9, but it did go down this past year. And then the number, and it's based off of the number of students that have had a previous access score, and because of the participation rate in 2021, that's the reason that that number did change. Also, any students that are reclassified no longer need the services. Kindergartners coming in or new students, we wouldn't have a previous score for them, so that is a smaller portion of the population. And this one just kind of gives a year-to-year comparison of the composite score across the last 5 years. And as you can see, there was some change and some attention needed to some of these scores. Any questions on that, on WIDA access scores, before we move on to STEM?
I have a quick question for Dr. Hallberg. Are there any students who don't take any exams that we kind of, that was a smaller number of students than I don't know what I thought the number would be. Are there any students in our district that were like, we actually don't administer any of these more structured exams to?
There are a few students where parents opt out.
Gotcha. So it is up to the parent.
It's up to the parent. We administer, the dynamic learning map is designed to be administered to any student, irregardless of their cognitive abilities.
So we wouldn't limit any student, it would be if their parent decides that. Thank you.
I just have a quick question, I think, about access, just in terms of like PLC work, work that's sort of more broadly looking at some of the generalized testing, how much classroom teachers are digging into access scores and supports that they're getting. Obviously we have support resources and certified staff that help presumably with our language learners that are at the lower proficiency levels, but just in terms of, me as a classroom teacher wanting to have an understanding, especially if I have a student that's, a level 3 in oral, but a level 1 or so in writing, and just the ways in which I can navigate that on a day-to-day basis as a classroom teacher.
In our multilingual programs, that is something that we look at as far as the general education classroom. I know it's included in our continuous improvement. So that's something that is being looked at the leadership level of the schools.
And the co-teaching efforts that are being made, at a number of our schools really do incorporate some of those things, and what are the teaching practices that support development here that all students would benefit from, and normalizing some of those things in classrooms, and are very much guided by our amazing BRT and ESL staff in our schools, and supporting those classrooms around teaching practices and supporting them around particular students through the plans of support that are there to support our multilingual learners that do benefit all students when used in class.
I would also add that as we move forward, more coherence around designing lessons that are standards aligned, and providing evidence of students' progression in those skills. We're also wanting to be sure that we are designing those lessons related to language standards, so using the WIDA standards as well as the academic standards in the picture of teaching and learning, and specifically learning lessons.
So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the STAMP for SE, standards-based measure of proficiency for skills in elementary. It is an assessment that's being used at our international school to measure growth in Mandarin. Again, in the 4 domains, reading, writing, listening, and speaking. It is an adaptive test, and it is designed for elementary students. Many times we use different exams that are based off of the Council for Teaching Foreign Languages standards, and but this one is made specifically for elementary students. Okay, I wanted you to look at this, and just I will walk you through it because as you see this graph, it might, just to explain to you the different levels as well as the trends across the nation and the growth that we are seeing in their students. So if you see on the right-hand side, it's different color coding. The highest one is the intermediate high, the blue. And that level is the level that we want. So we have the program here in the Verona Area School District for the Sealed by Literacy. The proficiency level that our students need to meet by the time they end high school is intermediate high. And so when we're planning out what proficiency level should look like for students in the international school, taking that into account, as you can see, some of our students are already meeting that. So that's something to be pretty proud of. One other thing that I wanted you to be aware of is that we do have we work with a resource, which is called Level Learning. So consultant from that resource that we use in that school did explain to me that across the nation, because of the nature of the emergent programs, as well as the teacher being the model, the language model for the students, many times students do reach intermediate mid by the end of their school experience. So it's something that they're aware of and they're working with, and something that we can look at as well. As you can see, proficiency for VAIS is in writing. That's the highest one that they have, as well as speaking. And so this gives us an insight on the priorities that the school has with expressive language. So especially in the written form. Listening and speaking are the next highest scores that we have there. Trends with language development in general usually say that writing is the last language to develop, but in this case, we see a different story. So as Adam pointed out before, the data tells us a story, and this is what we see as the priorities at VAIS. Next thing I wanted to show you as well is just the highest amount of growth. So as you can see, it's color coded again, but a little differently. We want our students to be able to grow at least one level per year. You can see in some cases, the students have grown exponentially, especially in the area of speaking, and then followed by writing. Again, pointing to the priority that the international school has with expressive language. Okay, any questions about the STAMP test?
Do we have the same data for the tweeting programs?
For
For Spanish speaking, yeah, for the TWEET program.
we have the STAR data that we've been using.
And then you just give them that exam in Spanish to see how well they score. That's efficient.
One thing that we do have for students that are at the high school is that stamp data is being used for their sealed by literacy. Okay, before passing the baton on to Karen, I just wanted to give you a little snapshot as well with high school completion. For your high school completion, as you can see 95.7% of students in the 2021 cohort completed high school in 4 years. And then over the past 5 years, we've seen some gap closing, some gap persisting for certain groups. For Black and African American students, back in 1819, our graduation rate in 4 years was 75%. That has gone up over the years, 84%, 93.3%, and this past year, 91.7%. Now, keep in mind that the cohorts are, in 1819, they were 21, and now they are 33 students this past school year. For our Hispanic and Latinx students, in 1819, it was 95.1%, so about 78 students went down a little bit to 91%, the following year 94.4%, and then this past year 94.2% with 97 students.
Okay, so the last assessment that we'll talk about tonight is the high school assessment, the ACT and the ACT suite. The first thing that we wanted to be sure that you were aware of is that what had formerly been the Aspire test that students took as 9th and 10th graders has officially sunsetted. And the ACT suite now includes a pre-ACT assessment for students who are 9th and 10th graders. There are some real benefits to that decision on the part of ACT and certainly benefits for our students in that transition. One of the biggest benefits is that now the actual assessment design and the scoring specifically of the pre-ACT and the ACT is in alignment. So students can have an initial score in a pre-ACT as a freshman and begin to set goals for themselves in terms of a score that they would like to earn by the time they're a junior and in some cases a senior. The ACT is a critical assessment for undergraduate admissions. So for all of our students who are looking at a pathway to college, this assessment becomes an important indicator of, has an impact on decisions that get made for undergraduate admissions. So having that assessment suite be more in alignment for our students is a benefit. The other thing is that the Aspire test in the past had been a rather lengthy exam that took sometimes 4 days or more of periods of time for students to complete. And now with the new alignment, it will be basically a 2-hour and 10-minute exam that students will be able to take, and we will be able to support them in that assessment. So they'll be able to take it in one sitting and get the results. The pre-ACT and the ACT focus on reading, math, science, and English. There's no longer a writing component, which had been part of the Aspire as well. So reading, math, science, and English will be the focus areas for the pre-ACT and the ACT. One of the benefits of our commitment, our district-wide goal for disciplinary literacy, is that it indeed aligns with a lot of the ways that students are being assessed on the pre-ACT and the ACT. And we're hopeful that the data that can be collected now through the pre-ACT, although it's looking at a different cohort of students, as we don't really get the data until the following year, it can still inform the ways in which we're thinking about instructional practices in these content areas for that sort of aggregate large-scale decision-making that we can do. The next couple of slides speak specifically to results from what was the Aspire. Again, we want to make clear that the Aspire has now sunsetted. We're moving into a different testing suite. We wanted to share these results with you. So you can see in reading, in the aggregate, we saw some minimal growth. But again, the data tells a story to us, and we're seeing that for our focal group students, that we are seeing diminishing percentages of students who are at or above benchmark. So that data tells us a story in reading. The same is true in the mathematics results. We are seeing diminishing results in students who are at or above benchmark in our focal area students. Looking to that data story to figure out and develop a better understanding of the assessment itself, to figure out how we can support our students, all of our students, to be more successful. And then finally, science from the ACT Aspire results for the last 2 years saw some growth for our focal students, but again, still looking at what can we learn from the testing suite in order to make better decisions about instruction. The one thing about ACT and that suite is that it has often been seen as something separate from the high school experience, something that students who are college bound take in order to get through that undergraduate admissions process. And what we want to do is we want to continue to support our teachers in those departments to unpack the testing design, as well as have an experience of the testing, so that that disciplinary literacy work that we're doing at the classroom level can be informed by that, and vice versa. So that's some promising work that we can do moving forward. So that was it for that. I don't know if you have any questions about pre-ACT or that process.
I do have one, and this is maybe admittedly because of my previous frame, but I'm curious about opportunities for teachers to do like item analysis from the ACT in particular, because I know that's one when you say, how do we better prepare our students for that type of assessment? You know, that sometimes that disconnect that ACT sometimes has with how we're teaching and what's reflected on an assessment that's designed that way. So to come back to the question about being able to, as a teacher, to see how is ACT asking the question, how is the content being surfaced, and that availability to staff to do item analysis? Is that something that's?
Yes, we have a partnership with Equal Opportunity Schools, and Equal Opportunity Schools is an organization that essentially takes all of our ACT data and can slice it and dice it in all the ways that we want to, and can support us with that item analysis as well. So it's really about making that a way of working for ourselves. That we have very rich data on performance in ACT in terms of that item analysis piece, in terms of demographics, all of that. We just need to operationalize it so that it is another set of data that teachers are actually engaging with and learning how to have that informed practice.
And how does that work from a timeliness standpoint? Because also now I'm thinking like ACT feels forward-esque to me in terms of my ability to be responsive with what an ACT score might say versus what I can then do, immediate in the classroom. Any just anecdotal thoughts about that?
I think what it does is it ultimately informs the ways in which we want to design instruction around disciplinary literacy, and less about the specific focal groups. And going back to the narrative that we wanted to be sure that we communicated effectively tonight, that formative assessment, summative assessment in classroom work is where that information and that opportunity to really think about what does that student need next in order to perform well. But this high level, let's look at the types of questions that they're being asked and the ways that we can support them to understand that and to come to some good answers.
I have a context question as well. So if I look at the kind of comparisons, which I know we're trying not to do too much, but if I look at the comparisons of our focus groups in the 3rd to 8th grade area, right? And some of these, they've jumped 10 percentage points year over year. And then I go to secondary education and they've dropped 3 percentage points year over year. Clearly, you're a different human being from 7th grade to 10th grade, and different things going on in there. Can you kind of talk to us and frame for us, like, for high school, is this should we be looking at the year-over-year progressions or changes differently? In high school, does the pre-ACT play a different role? And is it a smaller data set than these other data sets we have to manage? Like, how should we think about those two groups?
Yeah, we're really different types of assessments between, if we're talking about STAR and ACT, right? And again, I think the one thing that we're looking to that may be a promising result is this, because the pre-ACT is now in alignment with the ACT in terms of design and scoring, that it might be able to inform a student, again, in that 9th and 10th grade process, to think about the skills that they're going to develop in order to achieve a score that they want as a junior. So when you talk about something like a STAR assessment that would be applicable to a high school setting, we don't have that in terms of having an assessment that we give 3 times a year that allows us to measure growth over time. But what we do have is we have the possibility to do some really good assessment design aligned to the standards that allows us to measure students' growth in those skills over time. That also speaks to the necessity of us making informed and thoughtful decisions about the curriculum that we adopt, which is partly why we're leaning into that work so significantly in the next couple of years. So we're doing a curriculum audit now. We're moving toward a curriculum adoption process, because it's that curriculum, especially at the high school level, and the richness of it, not only to meet the needs of all learners, but to have an assessment suite that's built on a growth model in skills. That's what we want. And right now, so often what's happening for teachers is that they're working to create these things on their own. And the more we can provide our teachers with high quality curriculum resources that do that, the better.
And I assume that that's also balanced with not just selecting curriculum for test scores, right? Like, I grew up in Texas where, like, the second half of the year you taught to that TOS test, right? Like, that was how you got your funding and that was all you learned. And so clearly I'm assuming we all don't want that. So I appreciate the complexity of the decisions that you all are making, and I appreciate them, because it's such a tough balance between trying to make sure that we're putting our students through the rigor we need, but not like handcuffing our creative and amazing teachers and being like, only teach this. So I appreciate the struggle and the data that's informing that.
And to your point, yes, we don't want to handcuff our teachers, but we want to make sure that they understand the standards. And so when they have a deep understanding of the standards, then they can take their creative juices and their expertise and teach the standard and apply all those amazing and wonderful things that they want to do. So it really starts with helping them understand the standards. Well, in addition to that understanding, helps us to make decisions to purchase curriculum that is aligned to the standard, and not just because it's, I don't know, it has all the bells and whistles. But so, I mean, all those things kind of go hand in glove as we're making these decisions to impact our students.
And another step we've been able to do is working collectively across our system to align our assessment calendar with what's available in EdClimber, with the training and resources we're providing people to live in that data, with our results policies, with our continuous improvement planning models, so that discussions in one support discussions in others too, so that we're also streamlining the conversations that we're having and moving in the same direction, using the same tools.
I hope it's obvious. It probably goes without saying that if the board results calendar needs to be moved, that's the most flexible piece of that. So if you're like, if you really assess 2.1 a month later, that would really help us, please don't hesitate to bring that up to the board.
So that'll take us to our
Sorry,
last.
maybe I shouldn't have done that.
That'll take us to our last slide, Adam.
Did I just segue him properly?
Adam served what he said was a nice segue, but thank you for your comment and being flexible and responsive. So finally, our last slide, our next steps. We're going to continue to share and discuss assessment and data with the board, specifically as it aligns to our results policies, as it supports our results policies, but more importantly, as it supports what's happening in the classroom. We're going to strengthen our data use, the routines to inform teaching and learning. And so when we think about, using EduClimber, and I heard someone ask, oh, what about our teachers and how do they use data and how do they use this information? That in itself is a huge, it's a huge area of learning for our staff. And so we're going to continue deepening teacher understanding so that they know how to manipulate and use data effectively in the classroom. We're going to equally value street data, staff and student and family voice. We're going to continue our focus to support an implementation of high quality formative assessment as part of instruction versus separate from instruction. So I kind of, think about in January, everybody's like, oh no, I gotta lose weight. So it's kind of I'm gonna do it in January and February, and it's just that one moment in time, as opposed to incorporating eating healthy the whole year long. And so that's what we want to do with data. Like, it has to be something that people are looking at all the time, and not just, oh, it's star window time, let's look at it now. It has to be something that you do. It has to be part, like a data lifestyle. And so it takes some time to get there. It takes time because, as many of us as teachers, secondary folks are a little different than elementary, but you didn't come up learning how to use data. It was something that somebody else did, or you had a statistician or a data person. And yes, that's important to have those people to really dig into it at the district level, but to have conversations about data, to use student work, to look at it, that's not something that teachers are naturally comfortable at doing. So we have to help them, and we have to, work. And so that's all part of our professional development. And so then lastly, one of our final next steps is to make data accessible to our parents. And so we have just, using EduClimber, we started with a small group of people, and then we took it to our CLSs, and then we had one data person in the school, and now we're moving where teachers across grade levels are wanting this, but we have to make it available to our parents so that they too are able to look at what their students are doing in the classroom. But also, there's a level of education that we have to provide for our parents so that they know what it is. So it's kind of a both and. Our teachers have to be prepared to talk and have an understanding of it, but then we also will have to provide education and help our parents know how to access it and understand it. So those are some of our next steps as we move forward at becoming a more data-rich, data-informed learning organization.
Thank you so much. I think what you're saying too is, educating our parents on how to use this. I mean, starting here with the board, educating the board on how to look at data. Data itself is not inherently good or bad. What are we doing with it? And that's the important part. And how is it helping to benefit our students? What story is it telling? And I think, Adam, as you continually said, what story does it tell? I think that's what we need to be focusing on, and how do we look at it through that lens. I have a feeling we'll be coming back to a lot of this information as we go through our results. So I appreciate the groundwork getting laid here. As we're changing into a more data-driven culture, it's a shift. I appreciate our teachers undertaking that mindset, and I appreciate the support that they're being given to undertake. That's a big shift. As a teacher, that isn't what I have learned how to do. So that this is a great overview, and I appreciate the work in making this culture of data actually seem understandable. It's not a black box of information that we don't have understanding of. So thank you.
Are there any other questions from the board? Dr. Clarity is thinking though.
I'm almost scared to say. First was a great presentation. So it goes to the question that you asked, Nicole, so I'll just say it. Because I don't want to, I think you said, well, you don't want us to compare data. That's not exactly accurate. We do want to compare it. We are, when we talk about being cautious of comparing one year to the other, we're specifically talking about the final score on the state report. Okay. We do have an expectation that we are monitoring cohorts and student growth throughout the year, and we are monitoring the number of students that move into proficient and to advanced. So those are trends that we should and must monitor, and that is compared. So I don't want to be in a space where I unintentionally or put a message that we don't want to compare something to another, because we do in those cases. But there is one big one out there that is very difficult to monitor from one year to the next, which is the final score on the state report.
I think you guys actually clarified that quite well, and I appreciate you taking the time to kind of say, like, there's a difference between those two things, so that.
Great presentation. What I'm really looking forward to seeing, and I think it was Nicole that brought it up, when we look at these exams and how the questions are being asked in relationship to our focal groups, I don't think it's a mystery when we look at reading, especially for Black and African American students, the numbers are lower than when we look at math and science. I think one thing I've noticed, and we've talked about it historically, is a cultural bias in the way those questions can be asked with regards to reading. So I'm really excited to see where we go when we look at these exams in detail and how these questions are being asked, and how the responses are being given.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, team.
Thank you all so much.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate your time tonight.
And that concludes the superintendent's report.
Okay, thank you. So we've already taken care of board action, so I want to move to public comment. We have one comment that was submitted, and it was submitted by Alicia Gautier. I would like to know if there are any other parents who are negatively affected by the transportation system at VASD. I have a child in kindergarten at Fort Knowledge who needs to ride a bus home 2 days a week due to our work schedules changing, but cannot because we apparently live too close to school. When I called the transportation line to coordinate care, I was told we lived too close and therefore he would need to walk home. I can't do that. My mom, who's 75, would be there to greet him after school, but cannot drive to pick him up. Furthermore, there isn't a wraparound care or after-school program that is offered. He would need to be bused to Madison for the YMCA program that quoted us at $2,000 for 2 days a week of after-school care. I can't be the only one in this predicament, and I'm wondering how BASD can support working families like ours who cannot be there to pick up our children 5 days a week at 3 p.m. So the great question, and we'll pass that on to, I think that is one that was submitted online, so it will be forwarded on to Mr. Weezy. Would that be the person who would just?
Actually, we've already responded.
Okay, thank you.
I think it's the awareness of our response.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Okay, so with that, then we are going to move to the superintendent consent agenda. Are there any questions about the items on the agenda? I'm in the wrong place on my agenda. Are there any questions about superintendent consent agenda? Last call. Hearing none, the consent agenda has been approved. Next, let's look at the board consent agenda. Any questions about the board consent agenda? Hearing none, the board consent agenda has also been approved. We look at future agenda items. We have our next meeting on December 12th. Then again, we have not until January 9th, so enjoy your winter break. January 23rd, and then we are still looking to figure a board workshop, January, February timeframe. And with that, unless there's anything else from the board, I will accept a motion to adjourn.
Just a reminder that circulation for nomination papers has started. So for anyone interested in running for the school board, and those are due at the end of the month. And turn them in early if you're able, so that the clerk can validate those signatures. You can understand why you kind of sit there, but.
Good reminder.
Reminder.
Thank you very much. Great reminder, thank you. Anything else from the board? Otherwise, is there a motion to adjourn? A motion from Nicole, is there a second?
Second.
A second from Joe. All in favor, signify with aye.
Aye.
Aye. We are officially adjourned. We may have a longer meeting next week, so just keep that in mind, folks. All right. Thanks, everyone. I'll take your stick.